The mountain took brides, but it never gave them back. That's what they whispered in Red Hollow when Eleanor Wren walked down the aisle in a dress white as January snow, her hand ice cold in her father's sweating palm. Every eye in that church watched her being fed to the beast. Rhett Talon, the scarred devil from the high ridge, the man they blamed for every missing traveler and every dark rumor the frontier could spin. She thought she was walking toward her death. The whole town pitied her. None of them knew the wedding was just the opening move in a war that would burn through winter and reshape them all. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The first thing Eleanor Wren learned about betrayal was that it wore her father's face. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November when she discovered him in his study, surrounded by ledgers bleeding red ink and empty bottles that had once held expensive whiskey. Charles Wren, the man who owned half of Red Hollow, who sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday, who shook hands with governors and spoke at town meetings about prosperity and progress, was hunched over his desk like a wounded animal, his silver hair disheveled, his collar undone. Eleanor had knocked twice before entering, a habit drilled into her by 17 years of expensive finishing schools and her mother's ghost. Ladies announced themselves. Ladies waited for permission. Ladies never barged into a gentleman's private space, but the ledgers were spread across every surface, and her father's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold his pen. "Father?" Her voice was soft, cautious. The study smelled of old paper and fresh desperation. "Are you unwell?" Charles Wren's head snapped up. For a moment, Eleanor saw something terrible flicker across his face. Not love, not paternal concern, but cold, calculating assessment. The look a gambler gives his last chip. "Eleanor." He said her name like a solution to an equation. "Close the door." She obeyed, her heart beginning to hammer against her corset. Through the window behind him, Red Hollow sprawled in the valley below, smoke rising from 100 chimneys, the mines chewing into the mountainside like hungry mouths. Her father had built half this town. The other half existed because he'd allowed it. "Sit down." Eleanor perched on the edge of the leather chair facing his desk, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. Perfect posture, perfect deportment. Everything her mother had taught her before consumption had hollowed her out and buried her 6 years ago. Charles poured himself another drink with unsteady hands. He didn't offer her one. Ladies didn't drink whiskey in the afternoon. "I'm going to tell you something," he said slowly, "and you're going to listen without interrupting. Do you understand?" Eleanor nodded, her stomach twisted. "The mines are failing." 4 words. They landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into implications she couldn't yet grasp. The seams played out faster than we projected. The investors— His jaw worked. "I borrowed against future yields, significant amounts. I promised returns I can't deliver." Eleanor's throat tightened. "How significant?" "Everything." His laugh was bitter. This house, the land, the operations, all of it leveraged against projections that were optimistic. She had been raised to understand business in the abstract, profit margins and railroad shares discussed over dinner like weather. But this was different. This was ruin, spoken in her father's hollow voice. "Can't you restructure the debt? Bring in new investors?" "I tried." He drained his glass. "They want immediate payment, and they want—" He trailed off, staring at something past her shoulder. "They want collateral I don't have." The study felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows. Winter was coming early this year, the old-timers said, brutal and unforgiving. "There is one option." Eleanor waited. The clock on the mantel ticked like a countdown. Rhett Talon made an offer. The name hit her like a slap. Everyone in Red Hollow knew that name, whispered it like a curse or a cautionary tale. Rhett Talon, the mountain savage, the scarred hermit who lived high on the ridge where the snow never fully melted. The man blamed for disappearances, for strange tracks in the snow, for the unease that settled over the town whenever someone mentioned the high country. "What kind of offer?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. Charles finally met her eyes. "Marriage." The word hung between them, obscene in its simplicity. You can't be serious. He'll pay off the entire debt, all of it, in exchange for your hand. Eleanor shot to her feet, the room spinning. I'm not livestock to be bartered. Sit down. Her father's voice cracked like a whip. Sit. Down. She sank back into the chair, her legs trembling. You think I want this? Charles's face had gone red. You think I haven't exhausted every other option? Talon is the only one with ready capital who's willing to take on the debt, and he wants you. Why? The question tore out of her. Why would he want me? We've never met. He's seen you, in town. Her father waved a dismissive hand. Does it matter? He's made his offer. I've accepted. No. Eleanor stood again, her hands clenched into fists. I refuse. I'll get work. Doing what? Charles's laugh was cruel. You can play piano and embroider pillowcases. You can recite French poetry. Those skills won't pay off $100,000 in debt. The number stole her breath. If I don't deliver on this arrangement, the men I owe will take everything. And Eleanor, his voice dropped, and for the first time she heard genuine fear in it. These aren't bankers. These aren't businessmen who'll be satisfied with seized assets. These are men who break fingers for late payments, who make examples. Then we'll go to the law. The sheriff owes me money too. Everyone in this town is connected to the mines in some way. When I fall, they all fall. He reached across the desk, his hand closing around her wrist. But if you marry Talon, the debt disappears, the town survives. You survive. Eleanor yanked her hand back. By being sold to a monster? By making a sacrifice that saves hundreds of families. Her father's eyes hardened. Your mother would have understood duty. The invocation of her mother, kind, gentle Margaret Wren, who had died coughing blood into embroidered handkerchiefs, was a low blow, and they both knew it. You have 3 days to prepare, Charles said, turning back to his ledgers. The ceremony will be Saturday. Small, dignified. Talon's already made the arrangements. I won't do it. Her father didn't look up. Then pack your things and leave tonight. But understand, if you walk out that door, you condemn this entire town to ruin. Every family that depends on the mines, every widow living on her husband's pension, every child whose father works underground. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart a war drum in her chest. 3 days, Eleanor. I suggest you use them to make peace with your decision. She turned and walked out, her legs mechanical, her mind screaming. Behind her, she heard her father pour another drink. The house that had been her home for 23 years felt like a mausoleum as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Every portrait on the walls, stern-faced Wren stretching back 3 generations, seemed to judge her. Every piece of inherited silver, every imported rug, every symbol of the prosperity her family had built suddenly felt like chains. Her bedroom was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Pale blue wallpaper, white lace curtains, books stacked on her nightstand, romantic novels and poetry collections that now seemed absurdly naive. The life of a girl who thought the worst thing that could happen was a boring marriage to a boring banker's son. Eleanor crossed to the window and looked out at Red Hollow spread below. Lights were beginning to glow in windows as afternoon faded toward evening. Families gathering for dinner, children being called inside. The ordinary rhythm of a town that had no idea their prosperity balanced on her shoulders. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. 3 days. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find a dress hanging on her wardrobe door. Not just any dress, a wedding gown. It was simpler than the elaborate confection she'd imagined for her wedding day during girlhood fantasies. No layers of imported lace or seed pearls, just clean white silk with long sleeves and a high collar, tailored to fit her exactly despite the fact that no one had taken her measurements. A note was pinned to the bodice in unfamiliar handwriting. For Saturday. R.T. Eleanor's hands shook as she unpinned it. The paper was heavy, expensive. The handwriting was bold, angular, surprisingly educated for a man the town called a savage. He'd been in her house, or sent someone into her house, while she slept. The violation of it made her skin crawl. She tore the note into pieces and threw them in the fireplace, watching them curl and blacken. But the dress remained, hanging like a ghost, like a prophecy she couldn't escape. The next 3 days passed in a blur of surreal normalcy. Her father went to his office each morning as if nothing had changed. The household staff went about their duties with carefully neutral faces. They knew, Eleanor realized. The whole town probably knew by now. On Thursday, Eleanor tried to run. She packed a small bag, took what money she could find in her jewelry box, and walked to the train station just before dawn. But the ticket agent, a spotty young man named Timothy who'd gone to school with her, looked at her with such pity that she knew before he spoke. "I'm sorry, Miss Wren. I've got orders not to sell you passage." "Orders from whom?" Timothy swallowed hard. "Your father, miss, and—" He lowered his voice. "Mr. Talon sent word too, said if you tried to leave town, I should let him know immediate-like." Eleanor's bag slipped from her numb fingers. "He's watching me?" "I think he's watching everything, miss." Timothy glanced around nervously. If I were you, I'd go home. It's not safe to cross him." She wanted to argue, to rage, to demand her rights as a free citizen. But Timothy's fear was genuine, and she was beginning to understand that whatever power her father had once held in Red Hollow, Rhett Talon's reach was longer and darker. Eleanor walked home through streets that suddenly felt foreign. People she'd known her whole life averted their eyes. Mrs. Henderson, who'd taught her Sunday school, crossed to the other side of the street. The baker who'd always saved her the first cinnamon roll on Saturday mornings pretended not to see her through his window. She was already dead to them, already lost to the mountain. Friday night, her father held a small dinner party. A farewell, though he didn't call it that. 6 of Red Hollow's most prominent citizens gathered around the Wren family table, picking at roasted duck and avoiding Eleanor's eyes. Mayor Jameson, red-faced and jovial, raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he announced, his voice too loud. "May tomorrow's union bring prosperity to all of Red Hollow." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "Is something wrong, dear?" Her father's voice held a warning. "I'm not feeling well." Eleanor stood, her chair scraping back. "Please excuse me." She didn't wait for permission, just fled to her room and locked the door. From below she heard the dinner party continue without her, voices rising and falling in false merriment. They were celebrating her sacrifice. Eleanor sat on her bed, still wearing her dinner dress, and stared at the wedding gown hanging across from her. In the lamplight, it looked less like a dress and more like a shroud. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, up in the mountains where the snow already lay thick, Rhett Talon was waiting. She'd heard the stories since childhood. How he'd appeared in Red Hollow 15 years ago, a stranger with scars and a silence that made grown men uncomfortable. How he'd built his cabin so far up the mountain that winter could trap him for months at a time. How he traded pelts and game for supplies, speaking only when necessary, his pale eyes unsettling in his weathered face. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd seen too much war. Others claimed he'd killed a man back east and fled to the frontier. The wildest rumors insisted he wasn't fully human, that he had wolf blood, that he could track a man across bare rock and kill silently in the dark. Eleanor had dismissed them all as frontier superstition. Mountain towns loved their bogeymen. But now she was being delivered to him like a character in a fairy tale. Beauty and the Beast. If Beauty had no choice, and the Beast had bought her with cold cash. She didn't sleep that night. Just sat by her window and watched the stars wheel overhead, counting down her last hours of freedom. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear. Eleanor dressed slowly, mechanically. The wedding gown fit perfectly, which somehow made it worse. Someone had studied her, measured her from afar, known her body's dimensions without ever touching her. Her father knocked once at 8 o'clock. "The carriage is ready." Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in white like a virgin sacrifice in some ancient ritual. She descended the stairs without speaking. The house was silent. No weeping maids, no last-minute protestations. Just her father waiting by the door in his best suit, his face carefully blank. Outside, a black carriage waited. Not the Wren family carriage with its brass fittings and velvet seats. This one was plain, functional, the horse's sturdy mountain stock rather than the high-stepping bays her father preferred. Talon's carriage. Eleanor climbed in without assistance. Her father followed, sitting across from her, and they rolled toward the church in silence. Red Hollow's streets were emptier than they should be on a Saturday morning. People watched from windows, from doorways, but few came out to wave or call congratulations. This wasn't a wedding. This was a funeral procession. The church stood at the edge of town, white clapboard with a modest steeple. Eleanor had attended services here every Sunday of her life. She'd been baptized at that altar, confirmed in that pew, had sat through countless sermons about duty and sacrifice in God's plan. Now the building looked different, smaller, more like a trap. The carriage stopped. Her father climbed out and offered his hand. Eleanor took it, her fingers ice cold, and stepped down onto frozen ground. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Perhaps 50 people, bundled against the cold, their faces a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Eleanor recognized most of them: the mayor, the doctor, several mine foremen, and their wives. The people her father needed to witness this transaction. The church doors stood open. Inside, she could see candlelight, sparse decorations, and at the altar, Eleanor's breath caught. Rhett Talon stood waiting. She'd seen him before, briefly, from a distance, once at the general store, twice in the street when he'd come down from the mountain to trade. But she'd never been close enough to truly look at him, and the sight of him now, solid and real and waiting for her, made her knees weak. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with shoulders that strained against his dark coat. His hair was black, longer than fashion dictated, pulled back from a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin. The scars everyone whispered about were real, a jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw, another across his knuckles, visible even from here. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter ice, and they tracked her approach with an intensity that made her feel exposed. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched her walk toward him with her father's hand clamped around her elbow, like a vice. The minister, Reverend Paulson, who'd known Eleanor since birth, looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Shall we begin?" "Yes." Her father's voice was firm. "Let's get this done." Eleanor wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except walk down that aisle toward the scarred stranger who'd bought her like property. But her father's fingers dug into her arm, propelling her forward, and the small crowd pressed in behind them, cutting off escape. Step by step, Eleanor walked toward the altar, toward Rhett Talon, toward a future she couldn't imagine and didn't want. When she reached him, Talon extended his hand. Eleanor stared at it, rough-palmed, scarred, twice the size of hers, the hand of a man who worked with violence. "Miss Wren?" His voice was deep, surprisingly cultured, not the grunt she'd expected. "Shall we?" She had no choice. She placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. Reverend Paulson cleared his throat and began the ceremony with obvious reluctance. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Eleanor didn't hear the words. Blood roared in her ears. Talon's hand held hers firmly, but not painfully, and she could feel the steady beat of his pulse against her wrist. He smelled of pine and wood smoke and leather, nothing like the cologne-soaked merchants and bankers she danced with at society functions. "If anyone has objection to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence. Of course there was silence. Who would object? Her father had sold her, and the town needed the mines to survive. Eleanor's voice cracked out before she could stop it. "I object." Every head turned. Talon's fingers tightened slightly on hers. "I object," she repeated louder. "I'm being forced into this marriage against my will. This is unlawful." Mayor Jameson stepped forward, his face red. "Miss Wren, please, this is unseemly." "Unseemly?" Eleanor's voice rose. "I'm being sold to a stranger to pay my father's debts, and you're concerned about propriety?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Her father moved toward her, but Talon shifted, placing his body between them. A subtle movement, but it stopped Charles Wren cold. "Eleanor," her father's voice shook with rage. "Don't do this." "Why not?" She was shaking now, months of fear and rage pouring out. "Why should I go quietly? Why should I pretend this is anything other than what it is?" Talon spoke quietly, his words meant only for her. "Because fighting here won't change the outcome. It'll only make it harder." She turned on him. And what do you know about what's hard for me? His gray eyes held hers. More than you think. But this isn't the place for that conversation. Then where? Eleanor demanded. In your mountain cave? In whatever primitive hovel you're dragging me to? Something flickered in his expression, not anger, but something else. Something almost like understanding. Yes, he said simply. Exactly there. The certainty in his voice, the absolute calm, should have terrified her. Instead, it punctured her rage, leaving her deflated and trembling. Reverend Paulson cleared his throat again. Should we continue? Eleanor looked around the church, at the faces watching her with pity and embarrassment, at her father, whose expression promised consequences if she didn't comply, at the mayor, already calculating how to spin this disruption into something less damaging. She was alone, completely alone. Fine. The word tasted like ash. Continue. The Reverend rushed through the rest of the ceremony as if the words might catch fire. Eleanor barely heard them. She responded when prompted, her voice mechanical, while Talon's steady answers rumbled beside her. Do you, Eleanor Margaret Wren, take this man? I do. Do you, Rhett James Talon, take this woman? I do. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. A pause. Reverend Paulson looked deeply uncomfortable. You may kiss the bride. Talon's hand came up to cup Eleanor's cheek. Gentle, careful, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, chaste, and nothing like the violent claiming she'd expected. His lips were warm against hers for 3 heartbeats, then he pulled back, his eyes searching her face. It's done, he said quietly. Eleanor felt nothing, numb. She was married to a stranger, and she felt absolutely nothing. The small crowd erupted in polite applause that sounded forced. Her father stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, now that the transaction was complete. Mr. Talon, my daughter is your responsibility now. I'm aware. Talon's voice was cool. The agreed sum will be transferred to your account by Monday. Our business is concluded. Charles Wren flinched at the dismissal. He turned to Eleanor, perhaps to offer some parting words, but she looked through him as if he were made of glass. Whatever he saw in her expression made him step back. Safe travels, he muttered, then turned and walked out of the church without looking back. Eleanor watched him go. Watched the man who'd raised her, who'd taught her to ride horses and read ledgers, who'd promised to protect her always, watched him disappear through the church doors, his debt paid, his conscience apparently clear. She was someone else's problem now. Talon's hand settled gently on her lower back. The wagon's outside. We should leave before the weather turns. Eleanor let him guide her out of the church, her body moving on autopilot. The crowd parted around them, and she heard whispered comments that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction. She couldn't tell and didn't care. Outside, a sturdy wagon waited, loaded with supplies and covered with canvas. The horses were massive, shaggy mountain breeds that stamped impatiently in the cold. Talon helped her up onto the bench seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her. He took the reins, clicked to the horses, and they began to move. Red Hollow fell away behind them. Eleanor watched the town shrink and disappear. Every familiar landmark, the church, her father's house, the general store, the school, receding into memory. The road began to climb almost immediately, winding up into the foothills where pine trees closed in on both sides. The temperature dropped. Eleanor had no coat. She hadn't thought to bring one, hadn't thought about anything beyond getting through the ceremony. She shivered in her white wedding dress as the wind cut through the thin silk. Without a word, Talon shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her, smelling of leather and pine and wood smoke, and the warmth was immediate. "You'll freeze," she said automatically. "I'll manage." They rode in silence for another hour. The road grew rougher, narrower, climbing steadily. Eleanor had never been this far into the mountains. The trees were thicker here, older, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't melted since last winter. When the road finally petered out into a narrow trail, Talon spoke again. "It's another 2 hours to the cabin. We'll need to walk the last mile. The path's too rough for the wagon." Eleanor nodded, too cold and exhausted to argue. They continued upward. The trail was barely visible under the snow, but Talon navigated it with the ease of long familiarity. Eleanor focused on not falling, on putting one foot in front of the other, on breathing through the thin mountain air. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they rounded a bend and Eleanor saw it. Talon's cabin. It wasn't the crude shack she'd imagined. It was a substantial log structure built into the mountainside, with a stone chimney and shuttered windows and a covered porch. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd arranged for a fire to be lit before the ceremony. He'd planned this. All of it. Talon helped her down from the wagon and led the horses toward a sturdy barn built against the mountainside. Eleanor stood on the porch, clutching his coat around her shoulders, and stared at the door that would lead into her new life. This was real. She was married to Rhett Talon, and this isolated cabin high in the frozen mountains was now her home. The door swung open. Inside, firelight danced across log walls and rough-hewn furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling warmth into the single large room. Eleanor saw a table, chairs, a kitchen area with cast-iron pots hanging from hooks, shelves lined with supplies. A ladder led up to what must be a sleeping loft. It was clean, organized, nothing like the savage's lair she'd imagined. Talon entered behind her, stamping snow from his boots. "You should warm up by the fire. I'll bring the supplies in." He moved past her, already returning to the wagon, leaving her alone in his home. Their home. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the room, still wearing her white wedding dress under his coat, and finally, the numbness cracked. She sank to her knees on the wooden floor and began to cry. Great wrenching sobs that tore from her chest, all the fear and rage and grief she'd held back for 3 days, pouring out in the firelit silence. She cried for the life she'd lost, for the father who'd betrayed her, for the future she'd imagined that would never be. She didn't hear Talon return, didn't know he was there until his shadow fell across her. Eleanor looked up, expecting anger or disgust. Instead, Talon just stood there, holding a crate of supplies, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll give you time," he said quietly. "Cry as long as you need." Then he turned and went back outside, leaving her alone with her grief. Eleanor wept until she had nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen and her body shook with exhaustion. The fire crackled. Wind howled outside, and slowly, she realized she was still alive, still breathing, still here. She pushed herself to her feet, wiping her face with shaking hands. Through the window, she could see Talon moving between the wagon and the barn, methodically unloading supplies, giving her privacy to break apart and reassemble herself. He could have watched, could have mocked her, could have demanded his husbandly rights immediately, taking what he'd paid for. Instead, he'd walked away. Eleanor moved to the fire and held her hands out to the warmth. Her wedding dress was rumpled, dirty at the hem from the journey. She looked ridiculous. A trunk sat against the far wall, and Eleanor opened it to find women's clothing. Simple wool dresses, thick stockings, sturdy boots, all in her size, all new. He'd prepared for her, had thought about what she'd need to survive a mountain winter. Eleanor changed mechanically, trading silk for wool, heeled slippers for boots that would keep her alive. When she emerged from behind a privacy screen Talon had apparently built into the corner, she looked more like a frontier woman than a society daughter. The door opened. Talon entered with the last of the supplies, his arms loaded. He glanced at her, noted the change in clothing, and gave a short nod of approval. "Better," he said. "That dress would have gotten you killed up here." Eleanor found her voice. "Where do I sleep?" Talon set down the crate he was carrying and pointed up at the loft. "There, I'll take the floor." "You're giving me your bed?" "You're my wife, and you've had a brutal day." He moved to the fire and began preparing something in a pot. "Eat. Rest. We'll talk tomorrow." Eleanor climbed the ladder to the loft and found a narrow bed with thick furs piled on top. The space was small but clean, and through a small window she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She crawled under the furs, still wearing her boots, too exhausted to undress further. Below, she heard Talon moving around, banking the fire, preparing for night. Her husband. The word felt foreign, impossible. Eleanor closed her eyes and waited for sleep to claim her. But even as exhaustion pulled her under, one thought circled her mind. Why had he done this? What did Rhett Talon really want? And when would she find out the true price of her salvation? Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe biting into wood. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn logs instead of painted plaster. The air was cold enough to see her breath. And the bed beneath her was narrow and hard, nothing like the feather mattress she'd slept in her entire life. Then memory crashed back. The wedding, the journey, the mountain. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body aching from yesterday's climb. Through the small loft window, pale dawn light filtered across snow-covered peaks. The world outside was nothing but white and gray, and the dark spears of pine trees marching down the mountainside. Below, the rhythmic chopping continued. Eleanor climbed down the ladder, her body stiff and clumsy. The main room was warmer than the loft. Talon had built up the fire before going outside. A pot of coffee sat on the edge of the hearth, and beside it, a plate covered with a cloth. She lifted the corner. Bread, cheese, and what looked like smoked venison. He'd left her breakfast. Eleanor poured coffee into a tin cup, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. The coffee was strong, bitter, nothing like the delicate tea she was used to. But it was hot, and it chased away some of the cold that had settled into her bones. She ate standing by the fire, too restless to sit. Through the window, she could see Talon in the clearing beside the cabin, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cold, methodically splitting logs. Each swing of the axe was precise, controlled, and the wood fell apart in clean halves. He moved like someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Someone who understood exactly how much force to use, where to strike, how to make the work look effortless. Eleanor watched him and tried to reconcile this man with the monster she'd been told about. The savage. The murderer. The beast who lived alone because civilized society wouldn't have him. But everything she'd seen so far contradicted the stories. The clean cabin, the prepared clothing, the breakfast left warming by the fire. The way he'd given her space to cry last night instead of demanding anything from her. It didn't make sense. The axe stopped. Talon straightened, rolling his shoulders, and turned toward the cabin. His eyes found her through the window, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the distance. Then he gathered an armload of split wood and headed for the door. Eleanor stepped back as he entered, bringing cold air and the smell of pine resin with him. He stacked the wood beside the fireplace without speaking, then moved to the wash basin and cleaned his hands. "You slept," he said finally. Not a question. "Yes." "Good." He poured himself coffee. "You'll need your strength. Winter's hard up here, and you're not built for it yet." Eleanor bristled at the assessment. "I'm stronger than I look." "Maybe." His gray eyes swept over her, clinical and assessing. "But you've lived soft your whole life, servants to cook your meals, fires built before you wake. You've never had to fight for warmth or food or survival." "And whose fault is that?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask to be here." Talon took a long drink of his coffee. "No, you didn't." The admission surprised her. Eleanor had expected him to defend his actions, to claim some right to her. Instead, he just stood there calm and unmoved by her anger. "Why did you do it?" The question burst out of her. "Why did you buy me like livestock? What do you want?" For a long moment, Talon didn't answer. He stared into his coffee cup, his scarred face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "What do you know about your father's business partners?" The question threw her. "What?" "The men he owed money to. Did he tell you who they were?" Eleanor shook her head. "He said investors, creditors. He didn't give names." "The Garrett brothers. Wade and Cole." Talon's jaw tightened. "They run operations out of Carson City. Mining claims mostly, but their real money comes from other things. Claim jumping, extortion. They've killed men for less than what your father owed them." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Your father borrowed from them 3 years ago," Talon continued, "promised them shares in the Red Hollow mines that would pay out double within 5 years. When the seams started failing, he tried to negotiate new terms. The Garretts aren't negotiators. How do you know this? Because I've been watching them. Talon set down his cup. They've been circling Red Hollow for months, waiting for your father to default. And when he couldn't pay, he paused. They made him a different offer. Eleanor's throat went dry. What kind of offer? You. Specifically. Talon's eyes met hers. Cole Garrett saw you in town last spring, decided he wanted you, told your father he'd forgive the debt if he delivered you to him in Carson City. The room tilted. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. My father wouldn't. Your father was 3 weeks away from agreeing when I made my counteroffer. Talon's voice was flat, factual. I paid off his debt in full. In exchange, you married me. Publicly. Legally. Which means Cole Garrett can't touch you without starting a war he's not ready for. Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. You're saying you married me to save me from them? I'm saying I married you because it was the only move fast enough and public enough to take you off the table. Talon crossed his arms. The Garretts respect property rights, in their way. You're my wife now, my property, in the eyes of the law, and I'm not someone they can push around quietly. Why? Eleanor's voice cracked. Why would you do that for me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Something shifted in Talon's expression. Something old and painful. I know what it's like to be traded like currency, he said quietly. To have the people who should protect you sell you out instead. I know what men like the Garretts do to women they think they own. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his jaw. I couldn't let that happen to you. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. My father was going to give me to them. Yes. He was going to let them. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to what Cole Garrett would have done to her in Carson City, far from anyone who might intervene. He was saving himself, Talon said, same as he did when he married you to me. Charles Wren looks out for Charles Wren. Everyone else is expendable. The truth of it hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her father hadn't been sacrificing her to save the town. He'd been sacrificing her to save himself, and the town's prosperity was just convenient cover. I need air. Eleanor stood abruptly, grabbed the coat Talon had given her yesterday, and stumbled toward the door. Wait! Talon moved to stop her. Don't. She yanked the door open. Just don't. She stepped out into the brutal cold, and it stole her breath. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the air felt sharp enough to cut. But Eleanor didn't care. She walked away from the cabin, her boots crunching in the snow, until she reached the edge of the clearing where the mountain fell away into a valley of endless trees. The view was staggering. Miles and miles of wilderness, untouched and indifferent to human suffering. No towns, no people, no betrayal, just clean, honest cold. Eleanor stood there until her face went numb, trying to process everything Talon had told her, trying to reconcile the father she'd thought she knew with the man who'd been ready to hand her over to criminals to save his own skin. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Talon approached slowly, carrying a thick blanket. You'll freeze out here, he said, draping it around her shoulders. Maybe that would be simpler. Maybe. He stood beside her, looking out at the same vista. But you're stronger than that. Eleanor laughed bitterly. You don't know anything about me. I know you stood up in that church and objected to your own wedding, even though everyone told you to be quiet. I know you've spent the last 3 days watching your whole life fall apart, and you're still standing. Talon glanced at her. That's not weakness. They stood in silence for a moment. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, hunting. What happens now? Eleanor asked finally. Now you learn to survive winter. Talon turned back toward the cabin. Come inside before you lose feeling in your feet. I'll teach you how to keep the fire going. Eleanor followed him back, her mind still reeling but her body grateful for the warmth. Inside, Talon showed her how to bank the fire properly, how to add wood without smothering the flames, where he kept the kindling, and how to stack it for easy access. His hands were patient as he demonstrated, his voice steady. He didn't talk down to her or assume she was helpless. He just taught her, step by step, treating her like someone capable of learning. Why are you doing this? Eleanor asked as she practiced building up the fire under his watchful eye. Because if something happens to me, you need to be able to keep yourself alive until you can get down the mountain. Talon handed her another piece of wood. Winter up here is unforgiving. Skills matter more than anything else. What could happen to you? Anything. Injury, illness, a storm that traps me away from the cabin. He shrugged. The mountain doesn't care about plans. You prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Over the next week, Eleanor learned what survival meant in Talon's world. He woke before dawn every morning, built up the fire, and prepared a simple breakfast. Then he'd go outside to tend the horses, check his trap lines, split wood, and do the 100 other tasks required to maintain life on the mountain. And every day, he taught Eleanor something new. How to melt snow for water without wasting fuel. How to identify which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her. How to read weather signs in the clouds and the way the wind moved through the trees. How to clean and maintain the rifles he kept mounted above the door. Why rifles plural? Eleanor asked one afternoon as he showed her how to load one of the weapons. Different purposes. This one's for hunting large game, elk, bear if necessary. This one's better for smaller targets. And this one, he lifted down a shorter, heavier rifle. This one's for defending the cabin. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held it. From what? Whatever needs defending against. Talon's eyes were serious. Mountain lions, wolves, men who might come looking for trouble. You need to know how to use it. He took her outside and set up targets, chunks of wood with charcoal marks. Then he showed her the proper stance, how to breathe, how to sight down the barrel. The first time Eleanor pulled the trigger, the recoil knocked her back a step and the shot went wide. Again, Talon said. She fired again, and again. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but slowly, painfully, she started hitting the targets. Good, Talon said after she'd put 3 shots in a row into the center mark. Now do it when your hands are shaking from cold and fear. He made her practice until her arms trembled with exhaustion, until loading and firing became muscle memory instead of conscious thought. If you ever have to use this for real, he said, you won't have time to think. Your body needs to know what to do. Eleanor lowered the rifle, her shoulder throbbing. Have you killed men? Talon was quiet for a long moment. Yes. How many? Enough to know I never want to do it again unless there's no other choice. He took the rifle from her. War's different from murder, but dead is still dead, and it still stays with you. That night, Eleanor asked the question that had been building since he'd first told her about the Garretts. What happens when they find out I'm here? When they realize you took me instead of letting my father deliver me to Carson City? Talon was sharpening a hunting knife, the wet stone making rhythmic scraping sounds. They already know. I made sure of it. Eleanor's blood went cold. What? I sent word to Cole Garrett the day after the wedding. Told him Eleanor Wren was now Eleanor Talon, legally married and under my protection. Suggested he find another woman to fixate on. You provoked him? I made my position clear. Talon tested the blade's edge with his thumb. The Garretts respect strength, showing weakness, trying to hide or run. That would have made them come after us harder. But facing them directly, drawing a line they know I'll defend, he shrugged. That buys us time. Time for what? For you to learn to survive. For winter to close the mountain passes and make it impossible for them to reach us even if they wanted to try. Talon set down the knife. And for me to gather enough evidence of their other crimes to make sure they're too busy defending themselves to come after you. Eleanor stared at him. You've been planning this for months. Since I heard about your father's debt and who he owed it to. Talon met her eyes. I told you. I know what men like that do to women they think they own. I wasn't going to let it happen to you. But why me specifically? There must be other women in danger, other people the Garretts have victimized. There are. Talon's jaw tightened. But I can't save everyone. I could save you. So I did. The simple honesty of it left Eleanor speechless. This man, this scarred, silent mountain hermit everyone feared, had inserted himself into her life and turned it upside down because he'd decided she was worth saving. She didn't know whether to thank him or rage at him for taking away her choice in the matter. As if reading her thoughts, Talon spoke again. I know I didn't ask your permission, I know I forced you into this marriage same as your father did, just for different reasons. If you hate me for that, I understand." Eleanor considered lying, considered giving him the cold courtesy she'd been trained to show unwelcome suitors. But something about this place, this isolation, this strange life she'd been thrust into, made pretense feel pointless. "I don't hate you," she said slowly. "I don't know what I feel about you. You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A monster." Eleanor smiled without humor. "The stories they tell about you in Red Hollow, you're a nightmare, a killer, a savage who lives in the mountains because civilization won't have him." "And now?" Eleanor looked around the cabin. At the neat shelves, the carefully maintained tools, the books stacked in the corner. She'd noticed those on her second day, surprised to find philosophy and poetry alongside practical manuals. "Now I think Red Hollow doesn't know you at all," she said. "And maybe you've worked hard to keep it that way." Talon's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "Fear's useful. People who are afraid of you leave you alone. Is that what you want, to be left alone?" "It's safer." He stood and moved to bank the fire for the night. "For everyone." Eleanor wanted to push, to ask what he meant, but the set of his shoulders told her the conversation was over. She climbed the ladder to the loft, wrapped herself in furs, and lay awake listening to Talon settle onto his bedroll by the fire. He'd been sleeping on the floor for a week while she took his bed. Never complained, never suggested alternative arrangements. Whatever else Rhett Talon might be, he was a man of restraint. The days began to blur together, each one a lesson in survival, each night a slow acceptance of her new reality. Eleanor's hands, once soft and carefully maintained, developed calluses from hauling water and splitting kindling. Her body, used to corsets and drawing rooms, grew stronger from the constant physical work required to survive. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she began to understand Talon's rhythms, the way he moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, the way he listened to the mountain, reading signs in the wind and the behavior of animals that told him when weather was coming. The way he never wasted anything, treating every resource as precious because up here it was. 2 weeks into her mountain exile, a massive storm rolled in. Eleanor woke to Talon already moving through the cabin, securing shutters and bringing in extra wood. "How bad?" she asked, climbing down from the loft. "Bad enough? We'll be inside for at least 2 days, maybe 3. He didn't look worried, just prepared. "Make sure the water barrels are full." By noon, the world outside had disappeared into a white maelstrom. Wind screamed around the cabin, and snow fell so thick Eleanor couldn't see the barn 20 feet away. The temperature plummeted. Inside, Talon kept the fire burning steady, rationing their wood to make it last. He'd prepared for this. Of course he had. But the storm's violence still awed Eleanor. Nature throwing a tantrum that could kill them if they made a single mistake. "This is normal?" she asked, watching the windows rattle in their frames. "For winter at this elevation, yes." Talon was cleaning tack, his hands steady and calm. "You'll see worse before spring." They were trapped together in the cabin's single room, unable to go outside, forced into proximity Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready for. But Talon seemed unbothered. He worked on maintenance tasks, sharpening tools, mending leather, organizing supplies, and left her to her own devices. Eleanor found herself reading one of his books, a collection of Whitman poetry that surprised her with its annotations in the margins. Talon's handwriting, noting passages and reactions. "You like poetry," she said. He glanced up from the harness he was repairing. "Sometimes." "I wouldn't have guessed that about you." "Most people don't guess much about me beyond the scars and the reputation." He returned to his work. "That's by design. Why cultivate that reputation? Why make people afraid of you?" Talon set down the harness and looked at her directly. "Because I came to this mountain 15 years ago to disappear. Fear keeps people away. Away means safe." "Safe from what?" His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his jaw. "From becoming someone I don't want to be again." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in his expression stopped her. Old pain, carefully locked away. She returned to her book and let the silence settle between them. That night, with the storm still raging and the cabin creaking under the wind's assault, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft listening to the violence outside and thought about everything that had led her here. A month ago, she'd been planning what dress to wear to the Christmas social, worrying about whether banker's son Thomas Morrison would finally work up the courage to propose, living in a world where those were the important questions. Now she was lying in a mountain cabin during a blizzard, legally married to a man she barely knew, learning to load rifles and split wood and survive in a wilderness that could kill her with indifference. Everything had changed. Everything. And somehow, impossibly, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back. The thought terrified her more than the storm. The blizzard finally broke on the third day. Talon dug them out, cutting a path to the barn to check on the horses. Eleanor helped, shoveling snow until her back screamed, and felt absurdly proud when they finally cleared the way. "Good work," Talon said, and the simple praise warmed her more than it should have. That afternoon, he took her hunting. "Time you learn to provide food, not just cook it," he said, handing her the lighter rifle. They snowshoed through the forest, moving quietly between trees heavy with fresh snow. Talon taught her to read tracks, deer, rabbit, the wide paw prints of a mountain lion that made her heart race. "That was 2 days ago," he said, studying the tracks. "He's long gone, but we'll stay alert." They followed deer sign for over an hour before Talon stopped, raising his hand. Ahead, partially hidden by a fallen log, a doe grazed on exposed bark. Talon positioned Eleanor, adjusted her stance, whispered instructions about breathing and timing. "When you're ready," he said quietly, "aim for the heart, quick and clean." Eleanor sighted down the barrel. The doe was beautiful, delicate, completely unaware of the danger. Her finger rested on the trigger. She hesitated. "Second thoughts?" Talon's voice was neutral, non-judgmental. "I've never killed anything before." "I know, but up here, squeamishness means starvation. That deer is meat for weeks. It's survival." Eleanor steadied her breathing, pushed aside the girl who'd been horrified by the mouse the kitchen cat brought in, became someone harder. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the forest. The doe dropped. Eleanor lowered the rifle, her hands shaking. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Talon squeezed her shoulder briefly. "Clean shot. She didn't suffer. That's what matters." He taught her how to field dress the kill, his hands guiding hers through the messy, necessary work. Eleanor fought nausea, but forced herself to pay attention, to learn. This was survival. This was staying alive. By the time they dragged the carcass back to the cabin, night was falling and Eleanor was exhausted. But she'd provided food. She'd contributed to their survival instead of just consuming resources. It felt like a victory. That night, over venison steaks cooked in the fireplace, Talon said, "You did well today. I threw up behind a tree while you were tying the drag rope. But you came back and helped anyway." He met her eyes across the table. "That's strength, not avoiding the hard parts, doing them anyway." Eleanor stared at him, this man who'd hijacked her life and was somehow, slowly, reshaping her into someone capable of living in his world. "Who were you?" she asked suddenly. "Before the mountain, before the scars. Who was Rhett Talon?" For a long time she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he pushed back from the table and stood at the window, looking out at the darkness. "Someone who made mistakes," he said finally. "Someone who learned too late that following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions. Someone who decided the only way to stop being that person was to walk away from everything and everyone I knew. The war. Among other things." He turned to face her. "I'm not a good man, Eleanor. I've done things I can't undo. But up here, away from everything, I can at least be a better man than I was." Eleanor stood and crossed to him. They were close now, closer than they'd been since the wedding kiss. She could see the details of his scars, the silver threaded through his black hair, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of years carrying weight alone. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me, for teaching me, for giving me a chance to become something other than my father's bargaining chip." Talon's jaw worked. "You don't owe me gratitude." "Maybe not, but I'm giving it anyway." She went to bed that night with her hands smelling of blood and gunpowder, her muscles aching from honest work, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Outside, winter deepened its grip on the mountain. Inside, Eleanor Talon began to understand what it meant to be someone other than Eleanor Wren. And somewhere in the valley below, in the town that had watched her wedding with pity and relief, her father counted his money and tried not to think about what he'd done. While high in the mountains, the man everyone feared as a monster taught his wife how to survive, how to shoot, how to stand against a world that had tried to break them both. The storm had been the first test. Eleanor had a feeling there would be more to come. December came to the mountain like an invading army, bringing cold so fierce it made Eleanor's first weeks seem mild by comparison. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning constantly. Water froze in the basin overnight, and the snow piled so high against the cabin walls that Talon had to dig out the door every morning just to reach the barn. Eleanor learned to read the morning by the sound of his shovel scraping against wood and ice. Some mornings she'd wake to find him already gone, checking trap lines or hunting before full light. Other mornings she'd climb down to find him at the table, studying a worn map by candlelight, his coffee growing cold while he traced routes with one scarred finger. "What are you looking for?" she asked one such morning, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. Talon didn't look up from the map. "Escape routes, in case we need to leave fast." "Why would we need to leave?" "Maybe we won't. But the mountain has 1,000 ways to kill you if you're not ready." He tapped a spot on the map. "This canyon fills with snowmelt in spring. This ridge is prone to avalanche. This valley is a wind tunnel that'll freeze you in minutes if you're caught in it." His finger moved across the paper, marking dangers she'd never see coming. "You need to know the safe paths, the dangerous ones, where to run if everything goes wrong." Eleanor poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "You really think something's going to go wrong?" "I think hoping for the best while preparing for the worst has kept me alive this long." Talon finally looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "The Garretts are quiet right now because winter makes us unreachable. Come spring, that changes. We need to be ready." The reminder sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd almost let herself forget about Cole Garrett and the threat he represented. Almost let herself believe this mountain existence was all there was. "Show me the routes," she said. So Talon taught her the map the way he'd taught her everything else. Patiently, thoroughly, making her repeat the information until it was branded into memory. Where the passes were, which ridges offered cover, where he'd cached supplies for emergency evacuation. Every piece of knowledge another tool for survival. By the time the sun rose properly, Eleanor could trace 3 different escape routes with her eyes closed. "Good," Talon said, rolling up the map. "Now, let's see if you remember how to shoot when your hands are numb." They went outside into cold so brutal it hurt to breathe. Talon set up targets while Eleanor's fingers fumbled with the rifle, clumsy in thick gloves. She'd practiced dozens of times over the past month, but never in conditions like this. "Lose the gloves," Talon instructed. "I'll freeze." "You'll adjust. Can't shoot accurately in those things anyway." He was already barehanded, seemingly unbothered by the cold that was making Eleanor's eyes water. "In a real fight, you won't have time to dress properly. You'll shoot however you are." Eleanor stripped off her gloves. The metal of the rifle was so cold it burned her palms. She sighted down the barrel, her hands already shaking from more than just nerves. "Breathe," Talon said from behind her. "Cold is just sensation. Don't let it control you." She fired. The shot went wide. "Again!" Eleanor reloaded, her fingers screaming protest. Fired again, closer this time, but still off target. "You're tensing against the cold. Relax into it." "Easy for you to say," Eleanor muttered, but she tried. Focused on her breathing instead of the ice forming in her hair. On the target instead of her aching fingers. The next shot hit center mass. "There." Talon's voice held approval. "Do that 4 more times." By the time he called a halt, Eleanor's hands were white and her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. But she'd hit the target consistently, even with her body screaming for warmth. Inside, Talon built up the fire while Eleanor held her hands close to the flames, waiting for the painful prickling of returning circulation. "You're getting stronger," he said, handing her a cup of hot broth. "Faster than I expected." "Is that a compliment?" It's an observation. But there was something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Though, if you want a compliment, you're not the same woman who showed up here 5 weeks ago ready to faint from fear. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were rough now, scarred from work, capable of violence. No, I'm not. Regret it? The question surprised her. Eleanor considered lying, giving the expected answer, but Talon had earned honesty even when it complicated things. Some days, she admitted, I miss hot baths and soft beds and not being constantly cold. I miss music and books and conversations about things other than survival. She met his eyes. But I don't miss being helpless. I don't miss being property my father could trade away. And I don't miss the woman I was becoming, decorative and useless and terrified of anything real. Talon was quiet for a moment. You were never useless, just trained for the wrong kind of life. What kind of life was I trained for? One where someone else did the hard things for you, where your job was to look pretty and manage servants and bear children for whatever man bought the right to own you. His voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment. Up here, that training means nothing. Up here, you survive on your own merit or you die. And you think I can survive? I think you already are. The words settled into Eleanor's chest, warm and solid. She was surviving. Against all odds, against every expectation, she was learning to thrive in a world that should have destroyed her. That afternoon, Talon took her to check his trap lines. They snowshoed through forest so quiet it felt like being inside a cathedral. Nothing but the whisper of their breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. Eleanor had learned to move quietly now, to place her feet with care, to disturb the forest as little as possible. There, Talon said, pointing. A rabbit hung dead in one of his snares, frozen solid. Eleanor had seen this before, had helped process game dozens of times now, but Talon didn't move to collect it. Your turn, he said. Reset the snare after. Eleanor approached the trap, her hand steady as she freed the rabbit and examined the mechanism. It was elegantly simple, a bent sapling providing tension, a loop of wire positioned exactly where an animal's head would be while investigating bait. She reset it the way Talon had taught her, making sure the trigger was sensitive enough to spring, but not so delicate it would false fire. Good, Talon said when she'd finished. You're thinking like a trapper now. They moved through the forest, checking each trap. Some were empty, but 3 more held game, 2 rabbits and a marten with a pelt that would bring good money when trading season came. Do you ever go to town? Eleanor asked as they worked. Twice a year. Spring and fall, for supplies I can't make or trap myself. Talon examined the marten, nodding approval at the clean kill. I used to go more often, but people's fear got tedious. Now I send supply lists ahead, pick everything up in one trip, and leave. Don't you get lonely? He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. I did. Before. Before you came, Eleanor realized. Before I was here. The knowledge shifted something in her chest. For all his talk of preparation and strategy, Talon was admitting he'd been lonely. That her presence, even forced by circumstance, had changed something for him. I was lonely too, she found herself saying, in Red Hollow, surrounded by people who all wanted something from me, but none of them really saw me. What did they want? My father wanted a bargaining chip. The eligible men wanted a well-bred wife to manage their households. The women wanted me to fit their idea of what a lady should be. Eleanor's breath fogged in the cold air. Everyone had a role they wanted me to play. None of them cared who I actually was underneath. And do you know who that is now? Eleanor considered the question. A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. Now, everything was uncertain. I'm learning, she said finally. They returned to the cabin as dusk painted the snow purple and gold. Talon showed Eleanor how to skin and butcher the game they'd collected, his knife work precise and economical. Nothing wasted. Every part of the animal used for something. You were a soldier, Eleanor said as she watched him work. It wasn't a question. Talon's hands paused. What makes you say that? The way you move, the way you think. Everything is strategy and preparation and efficiency. She gestured at the map still lying on the table. And you have escape routes planned for a threat that might never come. That's military thinking. Could be I'm just cautious. Could be. But you're not. Eleanor set down the knife she'd been using and faced him directly. You were a soldier, probably an officer given how you plan. And something happened that made you leave. Something bad enough that you've been hiding in these mountains for 15 years. Talon returned to his work, his scarred hands steady. For a long moment, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled. I was a captain, cavalry. I followed orders, led men, did what I was told because that's what soldiers do. His jaw tightened. And then one day, I followed an order I shouldn't have. Led my men somewhere we shouldn't have gone. Did something that can't be undone. What happened? People died who shouldn't have. People who weren't soldiers, who had no part in the war. Talon's knuckles were white around his knife. I realized too late that the orders I'd been following were wrong, that the cause I'd been fighting for was built on lies. By then I had blood on my hands that won't wash off. Eleanor waited, giving him space to continue. So I left, turned in my commission, walked away from everything, and came here where I couldn't hurt anyone else. He finally looked at her. That's who I was. That's what I did. And that's why people should be afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you. Maybe you should be. Why? Eleanor moved closer. Because you made mistakes in a war? Because you followed bad orders and learned from it? That makes you human, Rhett, not a monster. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Something shifted in his expression when he heard it. Human enough to recognize another person in danger and try to help, Eleanor continued. Human enough to teach me to survive instead of just keeping me alive. Human enough to sleep on the floor for 5 weeks and never once demand what the law says you're entitled to. Talon set down his knife with careful precision. What the law says and what's right are different things. You didn't choose this marriage. I won't take what isn't freely given. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor's heart was beating faster than it should. They were standing close now, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, the faint white lines of old scars layered over newer ones. And if I gave it freely? She heard herself ask. Talon went very still. Don't say things you don't mean, Eleanor. I'm not. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. I'm saying I'm tired of sleeping in a loft while you freeze on the floor. I'm saying I trust you more than I've ever trusted anyone. And I'm saying I'm not the society girl who walked into that church 5 weeks ago. That woman died on this mountain. I don't know who I'm becoming yet, but whoever she is, she chooses you. For a long moment, Talon just looked at her, searching her face for doubt or deception. Then slowly, carefully, he reached up and cupped her cheek with one rough palm. You're sure? I'm sure. He leaned down and kissed her. Not like the chaste peck at their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and thorough and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. Eleanor kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt something fundamental shift between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Talon rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. Good thing it's not about deserving. Eleanor smiled. It's about choosing, and I choose this. I choose you. That night, for the first time, Eleanor didn't climb the ladder to the loft. She helped Talon pull down furs and blankets, making a proper bed near the fire. And when they lay down together, fully clothed and wrapped in warmth, it felt less like surrender and more like claiming something that had been building between them since the day he'd told her the truth about why he'd married her. Talon held her carefully, as if she might break. Eleanor burrowed into his warmth, feeling safer than she had in her entire life. Tell me something true, she said into the darkness. Like what? Anything. Something you've never told anyone. Talon was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he'd fallen asleep. Then his voice rumbled against her back. I saw you in Red Hollow 9 months before I made the offer for your hand. You were at the mercantile arguing with the owner about overcharging. You were fierce and certain and completely unafraid. He paused. I thought then that you were wasted in that town, that someone with that much fire shouldn't be decorating parlors and pouring tea. Eleanor rolled over to face him, their faces inches apart in the firelight. You've been watching me for 9 months? Not watching, noticing. His hand came up to brush hair from her face. When I heard about your father's debt and who he owed, I knew what they'd do to you. Knew they'd try to break that fire and make you into something manageable and afraid. I couldn't let that happen. So you married me to save my fire? I married you because the world has enough broken people. It didn't need one more. Eleanor kissed him again, softer this time. Thank you for seeing me. The real me, not the performance everyone else wanted. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, while outside the mountain wind howled and winter tightened its grip. The weeks that followed were different, softer in some ways, harder in others. They fell into a rhythm that was almost domestic, sharing the bed, sharing work, sharing the quiet moments between tasks. But Talon never stopped training her, never let her forget that their peace was temporary. He taught her to track in snow, reading the subtle signs that separated a rabbit's trail from a fox's, showed her how to build a fire in wind and wet conditions, made her practice knife work until her hands were blistered and she could strike faster than thought. Why are you pushing so hard? Eleanor asked one afternoon after he'd made her run escape drills until she collapsed in the snow. Because when they come, you won't get a second chance to be ready. Talon pulled her to her feet. Again. I can barely breathe. Then you'll learn to fight while you can't breathe. Again. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she knew he was right, so she ran the drill again and again, until her body moved on instinct, until exhaustion became just another obstacle to work through instead of a stopping point. January brought a brief warm spell that melted the top layer of snow and filled the world with the sound of dripping water. Talon used the break in the weather to take Eleanor further into the mountains, showing her the territory she'd need to know if they ever had to run. They hiked for hours, climbing higher until Red Hollow was visible as a tiny cluster of buildings far below. Eleanor stared down at the town that had been her entire world, and it looked impossibly small. I thought it was so big, she said. So important. Everything looks different from a distance. Talon stood beside her, following her gaze. Including yourself. Do I look different? He glanced at her. This woman in rough wool and sturdy boots, her hair braided back, a rifle slung across her shoulders, her hands competent and scarred. Completely, he said, and better for it. They made camp that night in a cave Talon had prepared long ago, stocked with firewood and emergency supplies. He built a fire while Eleanor unpacked their bedrolls, and they ate dried meat and hard bread while watching stars appear over the mountain peaks. I never saw stars like this in Red Hollow, Eleanor said. Too many lights in town. Out here, you see what's really there. No interference, no pretense, just reality. Talon fed another stick to the fire. That's what I love about the mountains. They're honest. They'll kill you, but they don't lie about it first. Eleanor thought about her father, about all the lies wrapped in fine manners and expensive suits, about how civilization's greatest skills seem to be concealing truth behind politeness. I prefer the honesty, she said. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. When they finally crawled into their bedrolls, Talon pulled her close, and Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, something like belonging. The warm spell broke 3 days later, and winter returned with a vengeance. A blizzard hit so hard it shook the cabin's walls and buried them under 6 feet of fresh snow. For 2 days they couldn't go outside, trapped in the cabin's single room with nothing but each other for company. Eleanor expected it to feel claustrophobic. Instead, it felt intimate. They talked for hours, about books and philosophy and the nature of justice. Talon revealed an education Eleanor hadn't expected, and she found herself arguing with him about Thoreau and civil disobedience while the storm raged outside. You can't just walk away from society's problems, she insisted. I didn't walk away from the problems. I walked away from being part of making them worse. Talon was oiling his rifle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is refuse to participate. That's just another way of hiding. Is it? Or is it recognizing your limitations and trying to do less harm? He looked at her over the rifle. I'm better for the world when I'm up here. Trust me. Eleanor wanted to argue more, but something in his expression stopped her. Whatever he'd done during the war, it still haunted him. Maybe being here, teaching her to survive, was his way of balancing scales that would never truly even out. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted so high against the barn that Talon had to dig a tunnel to reach the horses. Eleanor helped, her body strong enough now to work for hours without collapsing. "We make a good team," Talon said as they cleared the last of the snow. Eleanor paused, leaning on her shovel. "We do, don't we?" It was a simple observation, but it carried weight. They had become a unit, working together with the kind of efficiency that came from trust and practice. Eleanor could anticipate what Talon needed before he asked. He could read her moods and energy levels with uncanny accuracy. They had become partners. The thought should have terrified her. This was nothing like the genteel partnership of a society marriage, all separate spheres and polite distance. This was something rawer, more real. They were bound together by necessity and choice in equal measure, and Eleanor found she liked it. February arrived with blue skies and brutal cold. Eleanor's 24th birthday passed unmarked. She didn't mention it, and Talon had no way of knowing. But that evening he presented her with something wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a knife. Not a kitchen knife or a hunting knife, but something else. Perfectly balanced, with a handle carved to fit her hand exactly, and a blade that caught the firelight like captured lightning. "I made it for you," Talon said. "You needed something that was yours, that fit you specifically." Eleanor turned the knife over in her hands, overwhelmed. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the balance perfect. "When did you make this?" "While you were sleeping, the past few weeks." He looked almost embarrassed. "I wanted you to have something beautiful that was also useful, something that was both." Eleanor stood and kissed him, the knife still clenched in her hand. "It's perfect. Thank you." That night, lying in their shared bed, Eleanor realized she was happy, actually genuinely happy, in a way she'd never been in Red Hollow. The realization was startling. "What are you thinking?" Talon asked, his arms around her. "That I should probably feel guilty for being happy. My father sold me. I was forced into marriage. I should be miserable. But you're not." "No." Eleanor traced the scars on his forearm, learning their patterns. "I'm not. And I don't know what that makes me." "Human," Talon said simply. "You're allowed to build something good from bad circumstances. That's not betrayal. That's survival." Eleanor thought about that as she drifted toward sleep. About survival and choice and the strange alchemy that had transformed a forced marriage into something she would have chosen freely. Outside, winter ruled the mountain with an iron fist. Inside, Eleanor and Talon had built something warm and strong and theirs. But as March approached and the days grew incrementally longer, both of them felt the change coming. Soon the snow would start to melt, the passes would open, and the men who wanted Eleanor would finally be able to reach them. The peace they'd built was running out of time. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in early March, when Talon returned from checking his trap lines with blood on his hands that wasn't from any animal. Eleanor looked up from the bread she was kneading and went cold at the sight of him standing in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. "What happened?" "Someone's been watching the cabin." Talon moved to the wash basin, scrubbing his hands with methodical precision. "Found tracks. 3 men, maybe 4. They've been observing us for at least 2 days from the ridge above the eastern pass." Eleanor's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "The Garretts? Or men working for them?" He dried his hands and moved to the gun rack, checking each weapon with practiced efficiency. "They're not skilled trackers. Left signs everywhere once I knew to look. But they're armed and they're patient. That's dangerous enough." "What do we do?" Talon met her eyes, and she saw something fierce and protective burning there. "We prepare. Everything we've trained for. This is why." The next hours passed in controlled urgency. Talon moved through the cabin, securing shutters, positioning weapons at strategic points, filling containers with water in case they were trapped inside for days. Eleanor followed his instructions without question, her body moving on the training he'd drilled into her all winter. "How long do we have?" she asked, loading rifles with steady hands. Hard to say. Could be hours. Could be days if they're waiting for reinforcements. Talon positioned himself by the window, watching the tree line. But they'll come. Men like that don't ride this far into the mountains just to turn back. Eleanor thought about Cole Garrett, the man who'd decided he wanted her like she was a piece of property to acquire. A man who wouldn't accept that she belonged to someone else now, that she'd chosen a different life. I won't go with them, she said quietly. Whatever happens, I won't let them take me back. Talon turned from the window. I know, and they won't get the chance. The certainty in his voice steadied her. This wasn't the society gentleman who would negotiate and compromise. This was the soldier, the survivor, the man who'd learned violence and walked away from it but never forgotten how to use it when necessary. They waited through the afternoon, tension coiling tighter with each passing hour. Eleanor forced herself to eat, to stay hydrated, to maintain the routines that would keep her sharp. Talon watched the mountain with eyes that missed nothing, occasionally moving to check different angles, different approaches. As dusk began to paint the snow purple and gold, he spoke again. They'll come at dawn. That's when I'd attack. Catch us while we're slow before we're fully alert. You won't be slow. No, but they don't know that. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Let them think we're easy targets. Makes them careless. Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the window. Out there in the gathering dark, men were planning violence, planning to take her, to hurt Talon, to destroy the life they'd built together. Rage burned through her fear, clean and hot. I'm not the woman they think I am, she said. Talon's hand found hers, scarred fingers interlacing with hers. No, you're not. And that's going to surprise them. They took turns sleeping that night, one always awake and watching. When it was Eleanor's turn to rest, she lay in their bed fully clothed with her new knife strapped to her belt and tried not to think about what morning would bring. When it was her turn to watch, she sat by the window with a rifle across her lap and studied the shadows, looking for movement. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky bleeding pink and orange across the snow. Eleanor was at the window when she saw them. 4 men on horseback, emerging from the tree line a quarter-mile away. They rode slowly, deliberately, making no attempt to hide their approach now. A power play, announcing their presence, making Talon and Eleanor wait and worry. They're here, Eleanor called softly. Talon was beside her in seconds, his eyes cataloging every detail of the approaching riders. 4. Armed with rifles. The one in front is Cole Garrett. I recognize him from Carson City. Eleanor studied the lead rider. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 35, handsome in a cold way, the kind of man who knew his own appeal and weaponized it. He sat his horse like he owned the world. The others are hired guns, Talon continued. See how they're positioned? Flanking, watching the angles. They've done this before. The rider stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, well within rifle range, but not close enough to be an immediate threat. Cole Garrett dismounted with casual confidence and took several steps forward. Talon? His voice carried across the snow. I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like civilized men. Talon didn't move. Stay away from the windows, he told Eleanor. Don't give them a clear target. What are you going to do? Find out what they want. Stall if possible. Fight if necessary. He checked his rifle one more time, then opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door ajar behind him. Eleanor positioned herself where she could see and shoot if needed, but couldn't easily be shot herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the rifle. Cole Garrett smiled when he saw Talon. It was the smile of a predator who thought he'd cornered prey. There you are. I was starting to think you'd gone coward on me. State your business and leave. Talon's voice was flat, empty of inflection. Eleanor recognized the tone. It was the one he used when he was most dangerous. My business is simple. You have something that belongs to me. Cole's eyes flicked toward the cabin. A certain lady who was promised to me before you interfered. Eleanor Talon belongs to no one but herself. And she's my wife, legal and binding. You have no claim. I have the claim of a deal made in good faith. Cole's smile never wavered. Her father promised her to me. You swooped in at the last minute with your money and your mountain man theatrics. That's called theft where I come from. Her father had no right to promise her to you, or to me. or to anyone. Talon's stance was deceptively relaxed, but Eleanor could see the coiled readiness in his shoulders. Eleanor made her own choice. She chose to stay here. That ends the discussion. Does it? Cole pulled off his gloves slowly, making a show of it. See, I rode a long way through a hard winter to collect what's mine. I'm not leaving empty-handed. Then you'll leave dead. Your choice. The casual delivery of the threat made Cole's smile falter. Behind him, his hired guns shifted nervously. Clearly, they'd expected intimidation to work, expected Talon to be cowed by numbers. Big talk from one man facing four. One man who knows this mountain and has the high ground and doesn't mind dying to protect what's his. Talon's hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. Ask yourself if you're really willing to die for a woman you've never met. Because I guarantee you, if you push this, at least 3 of you don't leave this mountain alive. Maybe all 4. Cole's eyes narrowed. You'd kill for her? Without hesitation. Question is, would your men die for your obsession? Eleanor saw the calculation cross Cole's face. He was reassessing, realizing Talon wasn't going to fold or negotiate. The hired guns looked less confident now, glancing at each other. Send her out, Cole tried again. Let her speak for herself. If she truly wants to stay with you, I'll leave. You have my word. Your word is worthless, and she's not coming out here to be threatened or manipulated. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm offering a peaceful solution. Inside the cabin, Eleanor had heard enough. She moved to the door, rifle in hand, and stepped out onto the porch beside Talon. I can speak for myself, she said clearly. Talon tensed, his hand moving to intercept her, but Eleanor shook her head slightly. She needed to do this, needed to face the man who'd thought he could own her. Cole Garrett's eyes lit up when he saw her, and Eleanor felt her skin crawl at the hunger in that gaze. Eleanor, finally, he took a step closer. You're even more beautiful than I remembered. You don't know me. You never have. Eleanor's voice was steady, cold. I'm not leaving with you. I'm not leaving this mountain. I chose Rhett Talon as my husband, and I choose him again right now. Because he has a gun on you? Cole's tone turned solicitous, false concern dripping from every word. Sweetheart, if he's forcing you to stay, you just have to say the word. We'll handle this. Eleanor almost laughed at the transparent manipulation. I'm holding the gun, in case you haven't noticed. And the only person forcing anything here is you, riding up to someone else's home and making demands. Your father promised, my father sold me to pay his debts, and I don't owe him or you anything. Eleanor felt Talon shift beside her, a solid presence at her back. I'm exactly where I choose to be. Leave. Cole's face hardened, the false charm dropping away to reveal something uglier underneath. You really want to throw your life away on this mountain with a scarred hermit? You could have comfort, society, everything a woman wants. I have everything I want. Eleanor raised her rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at him, but making the threat clear. You have 10 seconds to mount your horse and leave before I shoot you for trespassing. The hired guns were definitely nervous now, hands drifting toward their weapons. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip into violence at the slightest provocation. Cole stared at Eleanor like he was seeing her for the first time. Whatever fantasy he'd built in his head, the helpless society girl who'd be grateful for rescue, was crashing against the reality of this woman in rough wool and worn boots, holding a rifle like she knew how to use it. You're making a mistake, he said finally. No, you are. Leave now, while you still can. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually listen. Then Cole's hand moved toward his gun, and everything happened at once. Talon was faster. His pistol cleared leather and fired before Cole's fingers even touched his weapon. The shot took Cole in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the snow. The hired guns went for the rifles, and Eleanor didn't hesitate. She fired at the nearest one, saw him jerk and fall from his saddle. Talon fired again, twice, and 2 more men went down. The 4th rider, seeing 3 of his companions down in the space of heartbeats, wheeled his horse and ran. Eleanor tracked him with her rifle but didn't fire. He was fleeing, no longer a threat. Cole was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across the snow. His face was white with shock and pain. Talon descended from the porch, pistol trained on Cole. "Eleanor, check the others. Make sure they're not getting back up." Eleanor moved carefully, rifle ready, to where the 3 hired guns had fallen. 2 were dead, clean shots to the chest. The 3rd was alive but unconscious, blood seeping from a shoulder wound similar to Cole's. "This one's alive," she called. "Tie him up. Use the rope from the barn." Eleanor did as instructed, her hand steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. She'd just shot a man, actually pulled the trigger and watched him fall. The reality of it sat in her chest like a stone, but she couldn't process it yet. Not while there was still danger. Talon hauled Cole to his feet, ignoring the man's groan of pain. "You've got one chance to live through this. Answer my questions truthfully. You shot me, and I'll shoot you again if you don't talk." Talon's voice was arctic. "Who knows you came here?" Cole's eyes darted around, looking for escape or aid that wasn't coming. "My brother, Wade. He's waiting in Red Hollow with more men." "How many?" 6, maybe 8. "When do you report back?" "Tomorrow." Cole was breathing hard, shock setting in. "If we're not back by noon tomorrow, Wade comes himself with everyone he's got." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. Tomorrow. They had until tomorrow before an army arrived at their door. Talon seemed to be thinking the same thing. His jaw tightened, and Eleanor could see him running calculations, planning. "Bind his wound," he told Eleanor. "Keep him alive for now. We'll need him." Eleanor tore strips from one of the dead men's shirts and wrapped Cole's shoulder with rough efficiency. He hissed in pain, but didn't dare complain, not with Talon's gun still trained on him. Once Cole was secured and bandaged, Talon dragged him and the unconscious hired gun into the barn and locked them inside. "They'll freeze," Eleanor said. "Not before tomorrow noon, and if Wade wants his brother back alive, he'll need to negotiate." Talon was already moving, striding back toward the cabin with purpose. "We need to move fast, pack only essentials, clothes, weapons, food for a week. We're leaving." "Leaving?" Eleanor followed him inside. "Why? We won this fight." "We won the first fight, but there's at least 6 more men coming, and we can't hold off that many in a siege." Talon was already pulling down packs, filling them with practiced speed. "We use our advantage. We know this mountain. They don't. We lead them where we want them, on our terms." "Where?" "The canyon. The one I showed you on the map." His hands never stopped moving, packing supplies, checking weapons. "There's a narrow pass, easy to defend, impossible to flank. We can hold them there until we find another solution." Eleanor's mind raced. The canyon was miles away, across rough terrain. But Talon was right. Staying here meant being surrounded and overwhelmed by numbers. What about Cole and the other one in the barn? "Wade will find them when he comes looking. They'll tell him we headed east toward Carson City. By the time he figures out we went north to the canyon, we'll be dug in and ready." Talon finally paused, looking at her directly. "This is going to be hard. Harder than anything we've done. Are you ready?" Eleanor thought about the man she'd shot, about the blood on her hands and the violence to come. She thought about running, about fighting, about the life they'd built being torn apart by men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. "I'm ready." They worked together with the efficiency of long practice, packing supplies and preparing the cabin for abandonment. Talon left supplies and firewood for the prisoners, enough to survive but not enough to be comfortable. A message to Wade Garrett that they weren't monsters, but they also weren't playing games. Within 2 hours, they were ready to move. Talon released the horses from the barn, sending them scattering into the wilderness. Without horses, the Garretts would have to come on foot, slowing them down. "One more thing," Talon said. He went to the corner of the cabin and pried up a floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. From it, he pulled wrapped bundles, papers, documents, small cloth bags that clinked with the sound of coin. "What is that?" "Evidence. Against the Garretts, against your father, against everyone involved in this mess." Talon packed it carefully into his coat. "I've been gathering it for months. If we survive this, it's our insurance policy." Eleanor stared at him with new understanding. "You've been planning this the whole time. Not just surviving. Winning. Survival is winning." But yes, I've been working angles they don't know about. He shouldered his pack. Ready? Eleanor took one last look at the cabin that had been her prison and then her home. The bed they'd shared, the table where she'd learned to clean her first kill, the window where she'd watched the mountain and learned to love its brutal honesty. Ready. They slipped out into the late afternoon, moving fast through snow that was beginning to soften with approaching spring. Talon led them north, away from any obvious trails, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to find paths invisible to untrained eyes. Eleanor followed, her pack heavy but manageable, her body strong from months of hard living. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals when necessary, every sense alert for pursuit. As night fell, Talon found them shelter in a cave formation he'd clearly prepared long ago. There was firewood stacked inside, along with emergency supplies. He'd been planning for this exact scenario, Eleanor realized, planning for the day when winter ended and violence came. They didn't risk a fire that first night, just wrapped themselves in blankets and shared body heat, eating cold rations and listening to the mountains settle around them. "We're going to make it," Eleanor whispered in the darkness. Talon's arm tightened around her. "Yes, we are." But even as he said it, Eleanor heard the doubt underneath. They were running from men with numbers and resources. Eventually, they'd have to stop running and face what was coming. The next day, they pushed hard, covering miles of brutal terrain. Talon's pace was relentless, and Eleanor pushed through exhaustion to keep up. She understood why now. Every mile was precious, every hour of lead time potentially the difference between life and death. They reached the canyon late on the second day. The pass Talon had described was exactly as he'd said, a narrow gap between rock walls maybe 15 feet wide, with high ground on both sides. Anyone trying to force through would be exposed, vulnerable, sitting ducks for defenders with rifles. Talon immediately began fortifying their position, using rocks and deadfall to create cover on the high ground above the pass. Eleanor helped, her muscles screaming but her mind focused. "How long can we hold here?" she asked. "Depends on how many they bring, how patient they are, how much ammunition we have." Talon positioned another rock. "Days, maybe. A week if we're lucky and they're stupid. And then? Then we improvise." That night, they did risk a small fire, well concealed in a rock shelter. Talon heated water and made something resembling coffee while Eleanor cleaned both their rifles by firelight. "I killed a man today," she said suddenly. Talon looked up from the fire. "Yes. I thought I'd feel different, guilty, horrified." Eleanor's hands continued their work, methodical and steady. "But I just feel necessary, like it was something that had to be done, so I did it. That's survival. Emotion comes later when you're safe enough to process it." Talon moved to sit beside her. "But Eleanor, that man was trying to take you, trying to hurt us both. You defended yourself and me. That's not murder. That's staying alive." "I know. Intellectually, I know." She set down the rifle. "But I also know I've changed. The woman who came to this mountain couldn't have done that, wouldn't have been capable. And the woman you are now? She'll do whatever it takes to protect what's hers." Eleanor met his eyes. "You're mine, Rhett Talon. This life is mine, and I'll fight for it." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and Eleanor kissed him back with the same intensity. They made love there in the firelight, knowing it might be the last time, knowing that tomorrow could bring violence and death and the end of everything they'd built. But tonight, they were alive, together. And that was enough. Dawn came too soon. Talon was already awake and watching when Eleanor stirred, his body tense with alertness. "They're coming," he said quietly. "Spotted movement on the southern approach about an hour ago. 8 men, heavily armed." Eleanor's heart kicked into high gear. She moved to the firing position Talon had prepared, checking her rifle with hands that barely trembled. Below them, the men entered the far end of the canyon. Even from a distance, Eleanor could make out Wade Garrett at their head, bigger than his brother, harder looking, the kind of man who'd built his life on violence and intimidation. They advanced cautiously, clearly aware they were exposed. But the canyon was the only way through this part of the mountain range, and they must have figured Talon and Eleanor had to be running low on options. When they were in the middle of the pass, Talon stood up in clear view. "Far enough, Garrett!" His voice echoed off the canyon walls. The men below froze. Wade Garrett's face tilted up, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see the rage there. "Talon, where's my brother?" "Alive, for now, in a place where he'll stay that way if you're smart about this." "You shot him!" "He drew first. I just drew faster." Talon's rifle was visible but not yet aimed. "You can have him back, but we're negotiating terms. The only term is you give me the woman. Then maybe, I let you live." "No." Talon's voice was flat. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around and leave this mountain. You're going to forget Eleanor exists. And in exchange, I don't send all the evidence I have about your operations to the federal marshal." Wade laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "What evidence?" "Financial records, witness statements, proof of claim jumping, extortion, and 3 murders in Carson City." Talon's voice was steady. "I've been investigating you for months, Wade. I have enough to see you hang." The laughter died. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Want to risk it?" Eleanor could see Wade's mind working, trying to decide if Talon was telling the truth. She hoped desperately that the evidence was as solid as Talon claimed. "Even if you do," Wade finally said, "won't do you any good dead. And there's 8 of us to 2 of you. Do the math, Talon." "I have." 3 of you die in the first volley. Maybe 4 if Eleanor's shooting well, and she usually is. The rest of you might take us down eventually, but you'll lose at least half your men doing it." Talon's voice carried perfect confidence. "That's an expensive price for a woman you've never met and a wounded ego. This is about honor, about agreements made and broken. This is about pride. And pride is a stupid reason to die." The standoff stretched, tension thick enough to taste. Eleanor's finger rested on her trigger guard, ready to fire the instant things went wrong. Then Wade made his decision. His hand moved toward his rifle, and Eleanor saw the intent a heartbeat before the action. "Down!" Talon shouted. Eleanor dropped behind cover as the canyon exploded with gunfire. Bullets pinged off rocks around them, and Eleanor returned fire, trying to pick targets through the chaos. She saw one man fall, then another. Talon was firing with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate and placed. 3 more men went down in quick succession, but there were still 4 of them, and they were finding cover, spreading out, making themselves harder targets. Eleanor reloaded, her hands shaking now from adrenaline. A bullet struck the rock inches from her head, showering her with stone chips. She ignored it, sighted on a man trying to flank their position, and fired. He dropped. 3 left. But Wade was smart. He was using his remaining men to cover his own advance, working his way closer to their position. If he reached them, if he got into close quarters, the advantage of high ground disappeared. Talon saw it too. "Eleanor, fall back to the secondary position. I'll hold here." "I'm not leaving you." "You're not. You're covering a retreat route. Go." Eleanor hesitated, then understood his strategy. If they both stayed here and got overrun, they had nowhere to go. But if she moved to the backup position they'd prepared, they had options. She scrambled backward, staying low until she reached the second firing position 50 yards back. From here, she could cover Talon's withdrawal if he needed it. Below, Wade was still advancing. Talon fired twice more, forcing him to take cover, but the man was relentless. Then Eleanor saw it. Wade's rifle jammed. He was fumbling with it, trying to clear the malfunction while his last 2 men provided covering fire. "Talon, Wade's weapon is down." Talon stood up, taking careful aim. Wade saw him, abandoned his rifle, and went for his pistol. Both men fired simultaneously. Wade's shot went wide. Talon's didn't. Wade Garrett fell backward into the snow, a red bloom spreading across his chest. The 2 remaining hired guns took one look at their fallen employer, then at each other, then turned and ran. Eleanor tracked them with her rifle but didn't fire. Like before, they were fleeing. The fight was over. Talon stood there for a long moment, rifle still trained on Wade's motionless form. Then slowly, he lowered the weapon. "Is he dead?" Eleanor called. "Yes." She scrambled down from her position and ran to where Talon stood. He was bleeding, a graze across his arm, another across his ribs. Not fatal, but painful. "You're hurt. I'm alive." He pulled her against him, both of them shaking with adrenaline come down. "We're both alive." Eleanor looked down at Wade Garrett's body, at the carnage spread across the canyon floor. 7 men dead or dying because they decided one woman was property worth killing for. "Is it over?" she asked. "This part is." Talon was already moving, checking bodies, collecting weapons. "But we need to move. Those 2 who ran will tell people what happened here. We need to be somewhere else when they come looking." They worked together, taking what supplies they could from the dead men, checking for documents or evidence of what the Garretts had been planning. Then they left the canyon, moving north toward territory even Talon hadn't explored. That night, camped in yet another hidden shelter, Talon let Eleanor bind his wounds. The bullet graze across his ribs was deeper than he'd first indicated, and she had to dig out fragments of cloth and debris while he gritted his teeth against the pain. "Talk to me," she said as she worked. "Distract yourself." "What should I talk about?" "Anything. Tell me something I don't know about you." Talon was quiet for a moment, breathing through the pain as Eleanor cleaned the wound. "I was married before the war." Eleanor's hands stilled. "What happened?" "She died. Cholera outbreak in the camp where I'd left her for safety while I was fighting." His voice was carefully flat. "I came back to bury her. That was the beginning of understanding that following orders and doing right weren't always the same thing." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Different life, different man." He looked at her, and Eleanor saw ghosts in his eyes. "But it's why I understand what it means to lose someone. Why I couldn't let the Garretts take you." Eleanor finished binding his wounds and kissed him gently. "Thank you for telling me." They held each other through the night, listening to the mountain wind and the sound of their own survival. Morning brought clarity. They couldn't keep running, couldn't spend their lives fleeing from one threat to another. They needed to end this permanently. "We're going back to Red Hollow," Talon said. Eleanor stared at him. "What?" "We have the evidence. We have witnesses. Cole's still alive in the barn if he survived the cold. And we have the truth." Talon was checking his weapons, already planning. "Wade Garrett is dead. The gang is broken. Now we take the fight to the people who enabled this in the first place." "My father." "Yes, and the mayor who looked the other way, and everyone else who thought they could trade human beings like currency." His eyes were hard. "Time to make them answer for it." Eleanor thought about Red Hollow, the town she'd left behind, about the people who'd pitied her and then forgotten her, about her father, probably sleeping soundly in his big house, his debts paid and his conscience clear. "Yes," she said. "Let's end this." They started the journey south, 2 figures against the snow, armed and dangerous and finished with running. The winter that had forged them was ending. Spring was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The journey back to Red Hollow took 3 days through melting snow and mud that sucked at their boots with every step. Spring was breaking winter's grip on the mountain, and the world was transforming around them, ice giving way to rushing water, bare branches beginning to bud, the first brave wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow. Eleanor had left this mountain in a white wedding dress, numb with fear and grief. She was returning in worn leather and wool, a rifle slung across her back, her hands scarred and capable, her eyes harder than any society girl's had a right to be. Talon kept them to the high trails, avoiding the main roads where the 2 surviving hired guns might have spread word of what happened in the canyon. They moved carefully, always alert, but Eleanor could feel the shift in Talon's energy. He wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. On the second night, camped in a shelter of pine boughs while rain drummed overhead, Talon spread out the documents he'd been carrying. "Look at this," he said, showing Eleanor a ledger written in cramped handwriting. The Garretts kept meticulous records. Every claim they jumped, every bribe they paid, every threat they made. Wade was paranoid about his brother skimming profits, so he documented everything. Eleanor studied the pages by firelight. There were names she recognized, town officials from Red Hollow, merchants who'd suddenly come into money, even a territorial judge. The web of corruption was wider than she'd imagined. "This is enough to bring down half the territory," she said. It's enough to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Talon's finger traced a particular entry. Here, December 15th. Payment to Charles Wren, $10,000. Quote, advance on Eleanor Wren delivery, spring payment. He took money from them before he ever talked to me. Eleanor stared at her father's name in black ink, proof of his betrayal. She'd known intellectually what he'd done, but seeing it written down, seeing the price he'd accepted for her, made it real in a new way. He sold me twice, she said quietly. Once to the Garretts, then again to you. He tried to. I paid off his debt, but I never gave him a cent for you specifically. Talon's voice was gentle. That's an important distinction. The debt was legitimate, even if his methods were despicable. But the Garrett payment, that was trafficking. That's federal prison. Eleanor let that sink in. Her father wasn't just a desperate man making hard choices. He was a criminal who'd sold his daughter to violent men for cash. Good, she said finally. Let him burn. They reached the outskirts of Red Hollow on the third day, approaching from the north where the forest gave way to cultivated fields and the first scattered homesteads. Talon wanted to scout the town's mood before they made their presence known. What they found surprised them both. Red Hollow was in chaos. Even from a distance, they could see unusual activity, crowds gathered in the street, armed men patrolling, and what looked like a gallows being constructed in the town square. That's new, Talon murmured from their vantage point in the trees. They moved closer, keeping to cover until they could hear voices and piece together what was happening. Found them in Talon's barn, half frozen and raving about murder in the canyon. 7 men dead, they say, including Wade Garrett himself. Talon's finally shown his true colors, killed all those men in cold blood. Eleanor and Talon exchanged glances. Cole had survived and made it back to town with his story, but the version he was telling painted them as murderers, not defenders. We need to see the sheriff, Eleanor said, before this gets worse. The sheriff's probably bought and paid for by your father and the mayor. Talon was studying the town with tactical precision. We go in there now, we might end up in that gallows. So what do we do? Talon thought for a moment, then smiled, a cold, calculating expression Eleanor had learned to recognize. We make an entrance they can't ignore. Come on. They circled around to the road that led into town from the south, the main thoroughfare that every citizen would be watching. Talon checked their weapons, made sure the documents were secure in his coat, and then took Eleanor's hand. Ready to shake things up? Eleanor squeezed his fingers. Let's give them a show. They walked into Red Hollow at noon on a Saturday, when the streets were at their fullest. The effect was immediate and electric. The first person to see them was Mrs. Henderson, the woman who'd crossed the street to avoid Eleanor before the wedding. She dropped her shopping basket, vegetables rolling across the muddy street. "It's them!" she shrieked. "It's the Talons!" Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Within seconds, every eye in the street was fixed on Eleanor and Talon as they walked calmly toward the center of town, armed and unbowed. The crowd parted around them like water around stone. Eleanor kept her head high, her hand steady on Talon's arm. She could feel their stares, hear the whispered accusations, sense the fear and fascination warring in every face. Good. Let them stare. Let them wonder. Mayor Jameson pushed through the crowd, red-faced and blustering, with the sheriff right behind him, a nervous-looking man named Porter, who Eleanor remembered as one of her father's drinking companions. "Rhett Talon," the mayor's voice boomed. "You're under arrest for murder. 7 men dead in the mountains. Witnesses say you—" "Witnesses?" Talon's voice cut through the mayor's bluster like a knife. "You mean Cole Garrett? The man who rode up to my cabin with armed men and tried to kidnap my wife? That witness? He says you shot him and his brother in cold blood. He's lying." Eleanor stepped forward, and the crowd's attention shifted to her. She saw shock register on face after face. This wasn't the delicate girl they remembered. "Cole Garrett and his men attacked us. We defended ourselves. His brother Wade drew first and died for it." "You expect us to believe a woman shot those men?" someone called from the crowd. "I shot 3 of them myself," Eleanor said clearly. "And I'd do it again." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Ladies didn't admit to violence. Ladies didn't speak of killing in broad daylight with pride in their voices. Eleanor wasn't a lady anymore. Sheriff Porter looked deeply uncomfortable. Now, Miss Mrs. Talon, you need to understand there's been serious accusations. Where's my father? Eleanor interrupted. The sheriff's eyes shifted away. Mr. Wren is indisposed. Indisposed. Interesting word. Talon's hand moved to his coat, and half the crowd flinched, but he just pulled out the ledgers, holding them up for everyone to see. Because I have documents here that show exactly what Charles Wren did, how much he was paid by the Garretts to deliver his daughter to them, how he took money from criminals and called it business. Mayor Jameson's face went purple. Those are lies, fabrications. They're Wade Garrett's personal ledgers, complete with dates and amounts. Talon opened one to a marked page. December 15th, payment to Charles Wren. January 3rd, payment to Mayor Jameson for services rendered. Want me to keep reading, Mayor? The crowd's energy shifted. People started murmuring to each other, doubt creeping into their certainty. Where is he? Eleanor demanded again, her voice cutting through the noise. Where's my father? The Wren house, someone finally answered. Locked himself in 3 days ago when Cole Garrett came back with his stories. Eleanor started walking. The crowd parted for her automatically, and Talon fell into step beside her. Behind them, she heard the mayor trying to regain control, heard Sheriff Porter calling for them to stop, but she didn't slow. The Wren mansion loomed at the end of the street, exactly as she remembered it. The grand columns, the manicured lawn, the symbols of wealth and status that had meant everything to her father. Eleanor walked up to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. Father, she shouted, I know you're in there. Come out and face what you've done. No response. Talon stepped back, assessed the door, and kicked it in with one solid blow. The lock splintered and the door swung open. Inside, the house was dim and stale-smelling, dust-covered surfaces that the maids should have been cleaning. Empty bottles littered the floor of the study. Eleanor found her father in his bedroom, sitting in a chair by the window with a pistol on the table beside him. He looked up when she entered, and she barely recognized him. Charles Wren had aged a decade in 4 months, his hair completely white now, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. Eleanor. His voice was a rasp. You're alive. Disappointed? No, He struggled to his feet, swaying. They said you were dead. Cole said Talon killed you in the mountains. Cole lied. Same as you lied. Same as everyone in this cursed town has been lying. Eleanor stepped into the room, Talon a solid presence at her back. I survived, Father. Despite your best efforts to hand me over to monsters, I survived. Charles reached for the pistol, but Talon was faster. He crossed the room and took the gun, tucking it into his belt. Sit down, Charles. We're going to have a conversation. Eleanor's father collapsed back into his chair. Up close, she could smell the whiskey on him, see the tremor in his hands. He was broken, hollowed out by guilt and fear. I didn't know, he said weakly. I didn't know what they'd do to you. The Garretts said they said you'd be treated well. They said they wanted to own me. Eleanor's voice was ice. And you sold me to them for $10,000. I've seen the ledger, Father. I know exactly what you did. Charles's face crumpled. I had no choice. The debts, the shame. I would have lost everything. So you sacrificed me to keep your mansion and your reputation. Eleanor felt nothing looking at him. No pity, no love, no residual daughterly affection, just cold, clear assessment. You traded your child to save yourself. I thought Talon would be better. When he made his offer, I thought, you thought nothing. You took the highest bid and convinced yourself you were being noble. Eleanor turned away from him, unable to bear looking at his weakness any longer. You're pathetic. Behind them, heavy footsteps announced new arrivals. Sheriff Porter appeared in the doorway with Mayor Jameson and several townsmen, all looking grim. That's far enough, the sheriff said, his hand on his pistol. You two have caused enough trouble. You're coming with me. Talon didn't move. On what charge? Murder, disturbing the peace, breaking and entering. The sheriff's list sounded desperate, like he was grasping for anything that would stick. Take your pick. And if I have evidence that your mayor and half the town council took bribes from the Garretts, that they enabled human trafficking and claim jumping? Talon held up the ledgers again. What then, Sheriff? Porter's hand wavered on his gun. Behind him, Mayor Jameson was sweating despite the cool spring air. Those documents are stolen property, Jameson tried. They're evidence of federal crimes, and I've already sent copies to the territorial marshal in Carson City. Talon's bluff was delivered with perfect confidence. Eleanor had no idea if he'd actually sent copies, but the mayor's face suggested he believed it. He should be arriving any day now to investigate. You really want to be arresting the witnesses when he gets here? The standoff stretched. Eleanor could see the sheriff calculating odds, trying to figure out which side of this would leave him less damaged. Then a new voice cut through the tension. Maybe someone should explain what the hell is going on here. A man pushed through the crowd in the doorway. Tall, weathered, with a silver star pinned to his vest. Not Sheriff Porter's tin badge, but a real federal marshal's star. Marshal Hawkins, he introduced himself. Got a telegram 3 days ago about criminal activity in Red Hollow. Rode straight through to get here. His eyes swept the room, taking in Eleanor, Talon, Charles cowering in his chair, and the nervous-looking town officials. Someone want to tell me why this place looks like it's about to explode? Talon smiled, and Eleanor realized he hadn't been bluffing at all. He'd planned for this, had set it in motion before they ever left the canyon. Marshal, Talon said, handing over the ledgers, I think you'll find everything you need to know in here. The next hours passed in a blur of official activity. Marshal Hawkins took over Sheriff Porter's office and began conducting interviews. The ledgers were examined, cross-referenced, verified. Cole Garrett was brought in from wherever he'd been hiding and confronted with the evidence. His story fell apart immediately under the marshal's questioning. Yes, he'd ridden up to the Talon cabin with armed men. Yes, his brother Wade had drawn first in the canyon. Yes, the Garretts had been paying Charles Wren for access to his daughter. Eleanor sat in the sheriff's office and gave her testimony with Talon beside her, telling the truth of what had happened, the forced marriage that became a rescue, the winter of training, the attack and their defense. She didn't embellish or minimize, just stated facts. Marshal Hawkins listened with a face carved from stone. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her directly. You've been through hell, Mrs. Talon. Yes, sir. But I survived it. Because of him? The marshal nodded at Talon. Because of both of us. He taught me to survive. I chose to learn. Hawkins made a note. The territorial governor is going to want a full report on this. The scope of the corruption, it goes all the way to the territorial judge. This is going to shake the whole region. Good, Eleanor said. Let it shake. Maybe next time people will think twice before treating women like property to be bought and sold. The marshal actually smiled at that. Indeed. By nightfall, arrests had been made. Mayor Jameson was in custody, along with 3 town council members and Sheriff Porter. Charles Wren was charged with human trafficking and fraud. Cole Garrett faced kidnapping and attempted murder charges. The town was in shock, its leadership decapitated in a single afternoon. But Eleanor felt no satisfaction, only exhausted relief. It was done. Finally, done. Marshal Hawkins found her and Talon as they were preparing to leave the sheriff's office. You two planning to stick around? I'll need you for the trials. We'll be available, Talon said, but we're going back to the mountain. You can send word when you need us. Hawkins nodded. Fair enough. You've earned your peace. He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, you did good work here. Not many men would have stood up to the Garretts. And Mrs. Talon, he tipped his hat to Eleanor. You're one hell of a woman. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Thank you, Marshal. They walked out into the spring evening. Red Hollow's streets were subdued now, people hurrying home rather than gathering to gossip. The town felt different, smaller, less significant. Eleanor realized she was seeing it the way Talon must always have seen it. Just a collection of buildings and frightened people. Nothing special, nothing worth sacrificing for. Where do you want to go? Talon asked. Eleanor knew what he was really asking. Did she want to stay here, reclaim her old life, Take back the mansion and the status that were legally hers as Charles Wren's only child? She looked at the big house on the hill, dark and empty now. Thought about the woman she'd been who'd lived in those rooms, who'd thought tea parties and social standing mattered. That woman was dead. Eleanor had killed her on the mountain and become someone else. Home, she said firmly. I want to go home. The cabin? The cabin. Talon's hand found hers, and something in his expression eased. Then let's go home. They left Red Hollow the next morning, carrying only what they'd brought with them. Behind them, the town would rebuild under new leadership, hopefully better than before. Charles Wren would face trial and likely prison. The Garrett Empire would crumble, but none of that was Eleanor's concern anymore. They climbed back into the mountains, following trails that were muddy with snowmelt and alive with spring growth. The journey that had taken 3 days going down took 4 going up, but neither of them minded. They moved slowly, savoring the freedom, the peace, the knowledge that the threat was finally over. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the cabin in the distance, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. This place, rough and remote and unforgiving, was where she belonged. The cabin had survived their absence. Some snow damage to the roof, evidence of animals investigating the interior, but nothing they couldn't fix. Talon had the door repaired within an hour, and Eleanor started cleaning while he checked the barn and the traps. By nightfall, they had a fire burning and were sharing a simple meal of supplies they'd carried from town. Marshal Hawkins offered me a job, Talon said suddenly. Eleanor looked up from her plate. What kind of job? Deputy Marshal said he could use someone who knows the mountain and isn't afraid of hard men. Talon poked at the fire. Would mean going after criminals, bringing them to justice, using the skills I've tried to leave behind. Do you want it? Part of me does. The part that spent 15 years hiding thinks maybe it's time to do some good in the world again. He met her eyes. But it would mean danger, travel, leaving you alone sometimes. Eleanor considered that. A month ago, the thought of being alone in the cabin would have terrified her. Now she knew she could survive. More than survive. Thrive. Would it make you happy? Would it give you purpose? Maybe. I don't know. Talon set down his fork. What would make you happy, Eleanor? We never talk about what you want, about your future. Eleanor thought about that. What did she want? Not the life she'd been raised for, that was certain. But what did she want instead? I want to learn more, she said slowly. Everything you know about the mountain, about survival, about medicine and tracking and all of it. I want to be someone people can come to for help, not someone who needs protecting. You're already that. Not enough. Not yet. Eleanor's mind was spinning with possibilities. There are other women out there, women in situations like mine was. What if we could help them? What if this cabin became a place people knew they could run to? Talon stared at her, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. An underground railroad for women escaping bad situations. Exactly. You could be a marshal, hunting criminals and bringing them to justice. And I could run the safe house, teaching women to survive, to fight, to become strong enough that no one can sell them or trade them or own them. Eleanor's excitement was building. We could do real good, Rhett, both of us, together. He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor worried she'd overstepped. Then Talon reached across the table and took her hand. That's the best idea I've heard in 15 years. They spent the next weeks repairing the cabin and planning their new life. Talon sent word to Marshal Hawkins accepting the deputy position, with the stipulation that his home base remained the mountain cabin. Hawkins agreed. Having a lawman in the high country made strategic sense. Eleanor began making contacts, quietly letting it be known through the marshal's network that there was a safe place for women who needed to disappear. She studied medical texts Talon ordered from Carson City, learning to treat injuries and illnesses. She practiced her marksmanship until she could outshoot most men. The first woman arrived in July, a young widow fleeing her dead husband's brothers who'd decided she was their property now. Eleanor taught her to shoot, to trap, to survive. After 2 months, the woman had transformed from a terrified victim into someone capable and fierce. She moved on to California with money Eleanor had saved and skills no one could take from her. More followed. One by one, then in small groups, women found their way to the cabin on the mountain. Eleanor and Talon became legends in certain circles. The mountain couple who'd stood against the Garretts and won, who now used their victory to help others. Talon's work as a marshal kept him traveling sometimes, but he always came home. And when he did, Eleanor would tell him about the women she'd helped, the skills she'd taught, the lives she'd changed. They were making a difference. Together. Charles Wren was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison for trafficking and fraud. Mayor Jameson got 10. Cole Garrett, for his role in the attacks and his brother's crimes, received 25 years. The trials made regional news, sparking conversations about women's rights and the treatment of daughters as property. Eleanor attended the sentencing, sitting in the courtroom in her mountain clothes with Talon beside her. When her father was led out in chains, he looked at her one last time. She looked back with nothing but indifference. He was a stranger now. The man who'd raised her had never really existed, just a performance, a mask worn by someone too selfish to be trusted with another person's life. Eleanor walked out of that courtroom free of him forever. Years passed. The cabin on the mountain became a known haven, whispered about in kitchens and parlors across the territory. Dozens of women passed through, each one leaving stronger than she'd arrived. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. All of them left transformed. Eleanor's hair began to show threads of silver by the time she was 30. Her hands were permanently scarred from work and weather. Her face bore the marks of mountain sun and harsh winds. She looked nothing like the society girl who'd walked into that church in a white wedding dress. She was proud of every change. Talon's work as a marshal brought him into contact with the worst humanity had to offer, but also the best. He brought criminals to justice and helped establish new laws protecting women and children from being treated as property. His reputation grew, not as a savage or a hermit, but as a lawman who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Together, they built something that mattered. On their 10th anniversary, Talon took Eleanor to the ridge where they'd stood after the canyon fight, looking down at Red Hollow far below. The town had changed. New leadership, new laws, new attitudes. It was still small, still frontier, but different. Better, maybe. "Do you ever regret it?" Talon asked. "Giving up the life you could have had?" Eleanor thought about the mansion, now owned by a mining company and converted to offices. About the society she'd been raised to join, which had moved on without her and forgotten she'd ever existed. "Not for a second," she said. "That life would have killed me slowly, made me small and afraid and decorative. This life." She gestured at the mountain, at the cabin visible in the distance, at the wild country that had tested and strengthened her. "This life made me real." Talon pulled her close, and they stood there together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow gold and purple. The mountain had taken a frightened girl in a white dress and forged her into someone unbreakable. It had given a soldier running from his past a chance at redemption. And it had brought them together in the brutal honesty of winter, where pretense died and truth survived. Eleanor had thought that church wedding was the end of her life. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. The legend people told in Red Hollow changed over the years. Not the story of the mountain savage who stole the society girl, but of the woman who chose the wilderness over civilization and became something extraordinary in the process. Of the couple who stood against corruption and won, who built a sanctuary for the desperate and taught them to fight. Some said on winter nights you could still see lights in the high cabin where the Talons lived, where women came broken and left whole, where the mountain's brutal honesty forged strength from suffering. Eleanor and Talon never corrected the stories. They were too busy living the truth. Years turned into decades. The frontier changed around them, civilization creeping higher into the mountains, but their cabin remained, a constant, a haven, a promise that no matter how dark the world got, there were still people willing to stand against injustice. When Eleanor was old, her hair white, and her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes still sharp and fierce, young women still found their way to her door. And she still taught them what the mountain had taught her. That survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about refusing to let the world make you small. That strength wasn't something you were born with, but something you chose every day. That love wasn't about ownership or obligation, but about choosing each other freely, again and again, through every storm. On a spring morning, much like the one when she'd first climbed the mountain in a white wedding dress, Eleanor sat on her porch and watched the sunrise paint the peaks gold. Talon was beside her, older now but still solid, still strong, still hers. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked. "Everything we built?" Talon's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the ease of 40 years of practice. "Look around," he said quietly. Eleanor looked. At the expanded cabin that now had guest rooms for the women who came seeking safety. At the garden she'd built that fed dozens every summer. At the trail leading down the mountain, worn smooth by all the feet that had climbed it, seeking help and hope. At the life they'd created from the ashes of forced circumstance and chosen violence. "Yes," she said, "it was worth everything." The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the peaks and new growth from the valleys. Eleanor breathed it in, this air that had sustained and tested her, and smiled. She had been sold like property, forced into marriage with a man everyone called a monster, dragged into a wilderness that should have killed her. Instead, she'd found freedom, purpose, love earned through choice rather than obligation. The town below had pitied her once, watched her walk to the altar like she was walking to her execution. They'd been wrong about everything. Eleanor Talon had never been saved by the Mountain King. She'd saved herself, with his help and guidance and partnership, and then together, they'd saved others. The brutal winter that had forged them was long past, but its lessons remained. Survive or die. Choose strength over comfort. Build something that matters. Eleanor had chosen. Every day she'd chosen. And in choosing, she'd become exactly who she was always meant to be. Not the society girl who'd walked into that church in white silk and terror. Not the victim everyone expected her to become. But someone harder, fiercer, more real than that girl could have ever imagined. The mountain didn't destroy her. It revealed her. And that, Eleanor thought, as the sun climbed higher and a new day began, was the greatest gift of all.